Uh-oh, an error occurred. I am so conservative,
Rationalized in my head. These are things I read in
and
the
I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
remembered
invited.
at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah.
I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. Welcome to the Unknown Webcast, and this is a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative. I can't turn left even when I'm driving, and Bill McKeever is concerned about that because I have to say that repeatedly. However, it also means I have to drive in circles, which shows that I am a big wheel. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. Today, Bill McKeever, founder and director of Mormonism Research Ministry, joins us to discuss Mormon Doctrine, separating what is official from folklore. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Yes, well, we're having some trouble here, aren't we? Greetings from sunny Florida, where the sun came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Let me put that slide up. That's what I was having trouble doing. We want to see those beautiful palm trees, don't we? Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is the Designer Jesus Collection. No more need your Jesus be the source of social embarrassment. Visit one of many Designer Jesus Collection runways in your vicinity. Our guest, our legal disclaimer, our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Bill McKeever, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the Webcast, although we probably would not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall into the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinion regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements. Notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too if you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access. Please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Greetings. Bill McKeever here is our regular applause that we don't have yet. Yay.
Ron is still working on that.
Still working on that. Actually, I haven't had time to work on that, so I'm going to work on it when I have time. So
I love being with you guys.
Well, somebody does. I hope our
yeah,
guests
exactly. So, Bill McKeever is the founder and director of Mormonism Research Ministry, a highly sought after author of many books, or at least one book that I like, and on the board of directors for evangelical missions to non-Christian religions. So we give you a lot of information to say he's a really important guy, or at least we want him to think he's an important guy.
Yeah.
Howdy, Bill.
We tell everybody that.
Yeah, thank you for that boost in my self-esteem. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we're working on the blog
Well,
this week, and one of the things that I'm kind of addressing is Christian mythology. Speaking about lore, Christian mythology, the idea that the Bible commands us to love ourselves. And I have sought in vain to find that passage. It actually assumes that we love ourselves, that we should love our neighbors in the same way. Love your neighbor as yourself. It already assumes you love yourself.
All you got to do is learn how to diagram sentences. This is what diagramming sentences is for. What is the command in the verse? Is to love your neighbor.
Your neighbor.
As. Okay. So but I want to thank you, Bill, for all the help you provided me. I just finished a 27-week Wednesday night presentation on the cults at my church. We spent, I think, 4 of those weeks on Mormonism, and the materials you provide on your website and on YouTube were extremely helpful. We did we showed maybe 2 of your shorter videos, or maybe I just showed clips. I really like the ones where you have the imitation gold plates and you try to get people to carry them. Those are pretty fun to watch.
It's a good illustration. It's a good illustration.
So appreciate that. So
now, for those who haven't seen the video and are uncertain what it is that we're talking about, and I have been to Utah and not only watched Bill use that demonstration, but was involved with it myself. In fact, he let me pull the little wagon that the golden plates are in.
The little
my little red wagon.
The little red wagon.
I'm kind of known as the old guy with the red wagon.
Yes. So, and he's always dragging his wagon around wherever he goes. So, what is the idea of the golden plates in the little red wagon, and why is that important in terms of talking with Mormons?
Well, it's definitely one of the foundations of a lot of the things that Latter-day Saints believe, because if the angel Moroni didn't really have gold plates to show to Joseph Smith and for him to retrieve and eventually translate them from the Reformed Egyptian into English, then really the foundation of Mormonism becomes very suspect, because it's the gold plates, you might say, that makes Joseph Smith famous. And for many Latter-day Saints, that's what confirms that he is in fact a prophet of God. He was chosen by God to deliver this ancient message that was written on plates of gold, as the angel said. And I know that becomes a controversy in and of itself, because a lot of LDS apologists don't want to go there and say that the plates were actually made of the metal gold. They don't deny that there was probably some gold content in it. But they realize that if the plates were in fact, as Moroni said, plates of gold, they would be much too heavy to carry. And so a lot of the stories about Joseph Smith carrying the plates around would be
if they were made of gold, how much would they weigh?
Well, gold weighs about 1,204 pounds per cubic foot. Joseph Smith gives us the size of the plates as being 6 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches deep. That comes out to 1/6 of a cubic foot. So they would have weighed 200 pounds. Now, a lot of Mormons will accuse me of saying, well, I'm saying the plates were 200 pounds. I said, I'm only saying that if the angel was correct in how he explained the plates to Joseph Smith. I'm only going by their record.
Maybe the angel was correct insofar as he was correctly translated.
Well,
no, that would be the Bible, not.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Don't get confused on that one.
Yeah, but it becomes a good illustration, because you had, for instance, Jeffrey R. Holland, who currently serves in the LDS Church as an apostle at this moment. And he gave a speech one time where he was saying that the story of the gold plates, it has to be believed the way Joseph Smith told the story. So this is what I do. I go back to the story, how it's related in LDS history books, and as well as Joseph Smith's testimony. And I kind of glean from all these reports and trying to stick as closely as I can to how this story is told to the LDS membership. And it's interesting because as I recite for the Mormon that I'm talking to, it becomes readily apparent that they have problems with the story because they start making up all these excuses. Okay, I'll give you an example. For instance, they'll say, first of all, well, of course Joseph Smith could have carried the plates because he was a, quote, buff farm boy.
He's buff.
Okay? I've heard that many, many times. That
Yeah,
same expression.
you read that description a lot in early 19th century literature.
Yeah. And I'm not doubting that if Joseph Smith was a farm boy, I'm sure he was probably buff, I have to imagine. I'll give him that. But when I start to explain that if the plates were gold as Moroni described, 200 pounds, that's like carrying a man underneath your arm. And Joseph Smith, the story says, he carried the plates under his arm for at least a part of the distance from where he retrieved them, and on the way taking them home, which his mother said the Smith home was about 3 miles away.
Wow.
And so,
one thing we have to establish, is Moroni the plural of moron? Was there more than one? Oh, there was only one Moroni.
No,
okay, gotcha.
No, there's only, yeah. Well,
so how many miles are we talking again?
3, according to what his mother said. Yeah.
200. Are we saying 200 pounds?
Well, I'm only going. See, this is the point. I'm only going by how the story is related in LDS sources. Right. And the Mormon apologists, however, they don't like the idea of the plates being made of gold. They give a number of reasons why that becomes problematic for them. One is they know that they would be too heavy for an individual to carry. And that's exactly right. My plates, my replica plates, are made of sheet metal, and so they certainly aren't as heavy as gold.
How heavy are they? They're about the same dimensions, right?
Same exact dimensions that Joseph Smith
Do we know how many plates there would have been? Did he indicate?
No.
Okay, so you tried to estimate what?
Yeah, I think I used a 22 or 23 gauge metal. Smith said the plates were as thick as common tin. Well, what does that mean? I don't know, but it doesn't really matter how thick the plates were, because I've had Latter-day Saints argue saying, well, the plates were probably very thin, and I go, well, if they were thin, that means there would have been more of them, because we're talking about 6 inches deep. It doesn't matter how thick the plates really were. They had to have, if they existed at all, which I don't believe they did.
But wait a minute, let's back up on the existence. Okay. I mean, I assume they had, just like the Apostle Paul indicates in 1 Corinthians 15, 500 witnesses, most of whom were still alive by the time it was published.
No, in fact, Joseph Smith was commanded to always keep the plates covered up. There is the testimony of the 3 witnesses, and also the testimony of the 8 witnesses, which is at the beginning of every edition of the Book of Mormon, where they claim to have seen the plates and hefted the plates. But when you look deeper into that testimony, you'll find that even LDS historians say it becomes a little bit controversial, because even the historians tend to agree that they were probably seen through a vision of some sort. And that's exactly what Volume 1 of the Documentary History of the Church says, that they saw, the 3 witnesses at least, saw a vision of the plates. Well, that's very different than actually seeing tangible plates. And it goes to this whole idea that Joseph Smith, he told the witnesses, the 3 witnesses, that they would have to pray in order to see the plates. And that's a question I'll often ask Latter-day Saints. I says, did you have to pray to see my plates? And they said, no. And they say, no. And I say, well, why? Because mine are real. You don't have to pray to see something that's real and tangible.
But is it really fair to use logic in something like this?
Yeah. I mean, Joseph, now, I don't even know how to say his name here, so I'm just going to put it up. Points out that Joseph also said he had to fight robbers while carrying the plates and ran the rest of the way home. So the story is that he had the plates under one arm. Did he not also carry a sword in the other hand?
No, he didn't. But according to the narrative, Joseph Smith takes the plate and he wraps them in a shirt of some sort. One account says a linen frock. And he tucks them under his arm and he heads for home, and he decides to get off of the well-traveled road. And and it sounds like he does this at the last minute, which is kind of suspect, because as he gets off this well-traveled road going to his house, he goes on this path of some sort. He's attacked by a man who was hiding behind a log with a gun, and this man with this gun hits Joseph Smith with the butt of this gun, and they get into a scuffle, and Joseph Smith is able to knock the man down with such force that he's not able to get up when Joseph Smith runs away from him. Now, he doesn't do this just once. He does this 3 times on the way home. Now, there's a lot of questions.
So it's 3 different robbers.
Yeah. And my question is, okay, if you guys know each other, which there seems to be some evidence to show that these guys were probably in cahoots together to steal the plates from Joseph Smith, because Smith belonged to this group of money diggers, as they were known. And from what I understand, one of the agreements of being in this group is you had to share from what you found. And Smith refused to share the gold plates with these guys. And so they were going to steal them. So here's the thing. If they were really working together, why did they spread out? They say that's a question. It would seem like just all 3 of you guys crouch down behind the trees on this path and just jump the guy.
But I'm sure he was strong enough to take all 3. I mean, if you're strong enough to carry 200 pounds of gold in one arm and fight off a bandit in the other, you could probably take 3 guys too.
Yeah. Well, he does this 3 times. 2 of the men, according to the narrative, were actually armed. One was not. When Smith was knocking down the last guy, he dislocates his thumb when he finally gets home. Now, he's doing all this in such a way, and this is where I explain to people, I think sometimes the movies tend to blur our thinking. And I often bring up the example in the best Western ever made, which of course was Tombstone. And you have the one scene
which version?
Oh, well, of course, the Sam Elliott and Kurt Russell version. That's the best one of all time.
Sam Elliott, of course.
Well, remember when Sam Elliott, I think it was Sam Elliott, goes in and he kind of hits Ike Clanton on the back of the ear with his pistol, and he just drops like a wet rag. I said, that's movies. That's not how it happens. That's just not the way real life is. But we kind of get that impression, I guess. It's easy to just knock somebody down with such force that they can't get up right after that. And Smith does this, 3 times? And he's doing it also while he's limping, because a lot of people don't realize when Smith was a boy, he had surgery on his leg. And the way the story goes is Smith walked with a limp for the rest of his life. So he's not only able to knock these men down with such force that they don't get up, but he's able to run away from them as well with a limp, carrying the plates, in his arms. And I don't say that he ran the 3 miles. I don't see anywhere where it says he ran the entire 3 miles, but he certainly did run a portion of it with these heavy plates. And I just think the story is incredibly impossible. I think Smith just made it up.
All I gotta say, if there's ever another Matrix sequel, I think they should do something like this in it. I think, I think there's enough.
Right, because that is realistic for sure.
Joseph Smith bending backwards and bullet
flies. Yeah. I think that would work really well.
Get Spielberg to work on that one, I guess.
Okay, so that is a story that is part of the Book of Mormon. It is central to Mormon belief about how Mormonism originated. So that wouldn't really fit into the category of lore per se for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
No, it wouldn't, because there's just too much that is written about this, and plus Smith's discussing this whole issue in his history, which is found at the back of the Pearl of Great Price. That's a part of Mormon scripture. Right. Now, a lot of what I'm reciting to Latter-day Saints comes directly out of history books that were printed by the church and vetted by the leadership. This new history book, and it's a new series that they started coming out with a few years ago called Saints. And in the first edition of this history book, it gives this account of how Joseph Smith retrieved the plates and the scuffles and so forth and so on. So I'm citing from that manual. And because it is a manual, a history book, Latter-day Saints are told that manuals are correlated. In other words, they go through a
Okay.
correlation department in downtown Salt Lake City, and they are to make sure that the history is exactly the way the leadership wants it told and wants it believed by the membership. And if it's correlated, that means that the first presidency, which would be the top three guys that run the church, that would be
Okay.
Russell M. Nelson, who's the current prophet, and his two counselors, which would be Henry Eyring and Dallin H. Oakes, they've signed off on this. This is what Latter-day Saints should believe. So that would not fall under the category of folklore. That
Right.
is something that we can go to if we're going to speak with our LDS friends about what they believe. We should feel perfectly confident to cite from this history manual, this history book, or any other manual that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has produced, because it has the approval of the first presidency. Now, experience has shown me that not every Latter-day Saint believes everything that the church has produced. You have a lot of Latter-day Saints that want to believe their own personal understanding of Mormonism. And so they can do that if they want. It's just that those are just mere opinions. And yet what's funny is oftentimes when I quote from good sources, I find some Latter-day Saints, not a lot, but some, if they disagree with what that leader has said on a given topic, they tend to just blow them off like, oh, I don't have to believe that. Well, they don't have to. They're probably not going to be disciplined or excommunicated because they disagree with a leader, unless, of course, they go public with those disagreements and start embarrassing the church. Then you could definitely get in trouble, either disfellowshipped or even excommunicated. But they are certainly allowed to have their own opinion privately. But when it comes to publicly espousing your disagreements with the church, that starts running into an area where you could find yourself being disciplined, probably more on a local level. Your bishop will take you aside and say, hey, brother so-and-so, you better knock that off. You're not under the radar anymore. And so you just need to behave. So they'll get an admonishment from their local leader, and hopefully they'll straighten out, and no more will be said about it.
Okay, so you're going to be at the Engage 2022 conference, EM&R's Engage 2022 conference. Boy, say that 3 times fast. In Tallahassee, Florida, in just a mere about less than 10 days, I think. And wow, you're going to be doing a workshop on this very topic. So tell us, and by the way, the links are in the bottom. If you want to participate in that conference, join us. It'll be, we'll have fun. I don't know if you will, but we'll have fun.
Yeah.
What is some of the areas of lore that you're going to talk about, and how does that impact witnessing to Mormons?
Well, I think what's important, if we're going to have an effective conversation with a Latter-day Saint, I think it is important that we cite references that Latter-day Saint should respect. And this is kind of where I'm going with this, because our good friend Keith Walker did a video several years ago that still just cracks me up because it's so true, where he's imitating a Mormon, and when something's brought up from a certain book, he says, oh, that's not official. That's not official, And so you can oftentimes hear Latter-day Saints say that, and some will say that about just about anything that they don't personally agree with. So what I'm trying to do in this workshop in discerning between what is supposed to be official doctrine, doctrinal sources, I should say, as opposed to folklore, is I go through and I show what we can use when we are trying to engage our LDS friends that Latter-day Saint should respect. And there are certain categories. Of course, it would be the written scriptures, which in Mormonism would be the standard works, as they call them. That would include the Bible. They use as their official version the King James Version. And they also have the Book of Mormon that we just talked about. It came from gold plates and so forth. And then they have the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a collection of revelations, mostly given to Joseph Smith. There are some others in there given to others in the church as well in the early years. And then you have the Pearl of Great Price. Now, these four sources, naturally, because they are considered scripture to the Latter-day Saint, it's fair game. You can use anything in there. And I would hope that Christians would use whatever they decide to use, and they would use it properly and in context, because that's always important. But they should not feel apprehensive about citing from the standard works. It gets a little stickier when you start quoting from the Bible, though, because they do have like an exemption clause on that, and that is Article 8 of the Articles of Faith, where they say that they do believe the Bible only so far as it is translated correctly.
Right.
So don't be surprised if you're talking to a Latter-day Saint, and let's say you bring up a passage and that individual doesn't agree with that passage because it seems to be a glaring contradiction to what they've been told is true. And they'll say, well, how do I know that's not been mistranslated? Well, that takes a little bit more work to show them why it hasn't been. I think we would all agree that our Bibles have been translated quite well over the years. And so I think we should feel confident in going to it. And even when there are some difficulties in our scriptures, if you have a Bible that's probably not a very inexpensive gift Bible, it may have a few notes in the columns to tell you about the controversies of a certain passage. So we're not afraid to talk about these things. They certainly are not deal breakers as to the authenticity of the Bible. But many times Latter-day Saints, when they find themselves confronted with a verse that troubles them, they'll just kind of say, well, how do I know that's translated correctly?
One of the ways that I have dealt with that, just on a personal level, is when I am going to go to the Bible. Number one, I go to a King James. Number two, before I even open it, because I have the quad, so I have their King James Bible. Before I even open it, I ask them, okay, now before we look at this, can you tell me what areas of the King James Version, which your church prints in your quad, are improperly translated, so we can avoid those?
Correct.
And without exception, they have said, I don't know of any. I said, okay, good. So I would be concerned that your church is publishing a Bible that they know is mistranslated already. And so I'm glad that they're not doing that.
I think, Don, that's a good challenge. I think that's a good challenge, because
that's preemptive, right, Don?
Right. If the Latter-day Saint is going to use that as an excuse, they should be prepared to demonstrate why they're using that as an excuse. Now, a Latter-day Saint could, and this is where, when you're using the King James, many times I like to use a Joseph Smith translation. Because I have a bound Joseph Smith translation that I often carry with me whenever I do outreaches and such. And that gets rid of that whole argument, because if this is supposedly translated by Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith himself said he finished that translation in July of 1833. Now, he says that, okay. Now, did he touch up a few things later on? Yeah, he did. But basically, he said he finished it in July of 1833. That's the words of Joseph Smith himself. Well, if he gives us this inspired version, and that's what it's also known as, then why can't we go to it? And so I find that the Joseph Smith translation works very well for me when I'm trying to show a Latter-day Saint what the Bible has to say. And I remember showing a verse to one particular young man, and it troubled him, and he fell back on that Article 8 argument, and he says, well, how do I know that's translated correctly? What version is this that you're using? And I knew where he's going. I says, well, it's not a King James. And he goes, well, if it's not a King James, I says, no, it's written by this other guy. And I turned to the title page, translated by Joseph Smith Jr., which of course is the prophet of their church and the one who was behind the Joseph Smith translation. It's kind of hard to use Article 8, I guess, when you're showing the very Bible that Joseph Smith worked on and translated by inspiration. And it's often cited, by the way, in some periodicals that the LDS Church has put out over the years. They often will turn to the Joseph Smith translation if it seems to suit them a little bit better in a given situation. I see the JSTs being cited quite often in some periodicals and even manuals. So there is a general respect I guess you could say, among the leadership of the church to cite it in its manuals. But I don't know if a lot of lay members of the church will feel comfortable with the Joseph Smith translation because he did this very early on. I mean, if he finished it, as he says, in 1833, a lot of the really weird doctrines that Joseph Smith comes up with later were not a part of his thinking at that time. So what we see in the Joseph Smith translation, you could say, is kind of what Joseph Smith believed at that time. Now, if he had done that in 1844, I would not be surprised at all if the Joseph Smith translation of 1844 would read very differently than the Joseph Smith translation of 1833. Because Smith was, in fact, incorporating his own ideas. He had no ancient manuscripts to go by. He had no Greek, had no Hebrew. He didn't have a working knowledge of either language.
But yet, how good was his English, though? I mean, I sometimes wonder about that. I mean,
well,
could he read? Could he read?
Oh yeah. I think that argument that I often hear Latter-day Saints quote Joseph Smith's wife that he could barely what was the phrase she used? Something barely compose a letter or something like that. I can't remember exactly how she worded it, but I don't find that to really be true. When you look at some of the early writings of Joseph Smith, I would say he probably far excels a lot of what we're cranking out in our public schools today.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, he seemed to write quite well for someone who was probably homeschooled for much of his life and didn't have a lot of formal education, as many living in upstate New York did not have at that time. So I would never say that Joseph Smith was so ignorant that he didn't have the capabilities. I think he very well had the capabilities, and he certainly had the imagination. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. But I do think that Joseph Smith, because he's making this up as he goes along, you see this evolution of theology where by the time he dies in 1844, when he's killed at Carthage jail, his belief system is very different than what it was when the church was founded in 1830. And of course, Latter-day Saints would attribute this to latter-day revelation that was given to their prophet. And this is why he was going through all these changes. And this is why Latter-day Saints believe today that we need latter-day revelation too.
It's almost like he had almost like he had a designer religion in a way, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and we do see that. We see a number of religions that pop up, and they all seem to really want Jesus of some kind. They just sort of design him differently as they go along.
Yeah. And so we have a sponsor who addresses this, and they ask a really important question. Do you cringe when the Christians you hang out with try to introduce Jesus to your non-Christian friends? Well, you can say goodbye to the days when your church's Jesus was a source of social embarrassment. Now even your church can keep pace with the latest fashion-forward trends in spirituality. Introducing the Designer Jesus Collection. These amazing new Jesus styles are hitting church runways and the most exclusive fashion shows at churches near you. You don't want to miss Yoga Jesus, Hipster Jesus, Buddy Jesus, Socialist Jesus, Mormon Jesus, and of course, Muslim Jesus. At Designer Jesus Collection fashion shows, you will find a Jesus you'll be proud to introduce to your most sophisticated, cutting-edge friends and acquaintances. Please observe the attendance requirements, cost of admission, your eternal soul, required attire, semi-formal. All proceeds benefit His Royal Majesty of the Kingdom of Darkness. The Designer Jesus Collection, London, Paris, Rome, New York, Salt Lake City, and coming to a church runway near you. So, Bill, you're going to show up for those, right? You want to get those designer ideas. I know you.
Exactly.
Okay.
You know what you're talking about actually works with other groups as well. You're saying go right to source material as you're making your points because they might want to deny it. We've had that with Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, and in one situation, we were meeting with a couple. She was a Jehovah's Witness. He was not. He wanted to be the one to decide where the kids would go to church. And so we set up a meeting with two elders, the couple, and Joy and I. And it was simple. They were going to make a case that Jesus is Michael the Archangel, and we were going to make a case that Jesus is Jehovah. We would only use their Bible, we said.
Mhm.
And so we went through and we made our case. At the end, we turned to them and we asked them to make their case that Jesus is Michael the Archangel. And they looked at us and said, well, we never actually taught that. To which Joy said, of course you did. They said, well, you'd have to show us. She said, okay. And she carries a folder file with her with a lot of copies of Watchtower material. And so she said,
Yeah.
okay. And he said, you'll have to show me now. And she said, okay. And she pulled out several Watchtower pages and put them in front of him. And he looked at it. And then he, in an embarrassed way, looked at the couple and looked at us. And then he said, well, I sort of remember that.
Sort of remembers that Jesus was created as Michael the Archangel.
As Michael the Archangel.
Sort of remembers that. I've never
Yeah.
met a Jehovah's Witness who wasn't aware of that. He was a Jehovah's Witness?
An elder of the Watchtower. Yeah.
He was a, okay.
Well, you know, it's interesting you bring up that story, Don, because I had a very similar incident take place when I was in the History Museum across from Temple Square, and they have this display over there of gold plates with a handlebar that you can lift up these plates to see how heavy they were. Now, here's what's interesting: the plates are not all made of metal, which should tell you something. Why did whoever put this display together, why did they feel it necessary to make the majority of the gold plates not made out of metal plates? It's some kind of a block of something. I don't even know what it's made of. I asked one guy that showed me those plates. They were stored down in the basement, and he showed them to me. It was the first time I ever saw them. And I asked him, well, what is this? And he had no idea either. Well, when I was talking to this one gentleman who was standing there by the display, he started to tell me that these plates weighed 50 pounds. I says, where did you get the 50 pounds? And he says, well, the plates were made of a light alloy, and so they weren't really made of gold. I says, they weren't. I says, well, the angel said they were made of gold. And he denied that. He said, no. Well, the problem with doing that is I just pulled out my phone, called up my Book of Mormon, or my History of Joseph Smith, and let him read it himself. And he acted like he had never seen that before. And I would think, that's pretty basic, the testimony of Joseph Smith and how the plates came about. But he acted as if he had never read that and kind of apologized that he was so ignorant on something like that. But he had read it for himself when I held up my phone and let him read it. Yeah. So you have a lot of things that you would assume the average member should believe.
Right.
But I find through it, and see, this is why it's important never to accuse a Mormon of believing anything. I don't do that. Right. I always ask questions. I always let them tell me what they believe, and how they answer the question is going to determine how I frame the next question. And I find that to be the least offensive way of approaching it, because nobody likes being told you're wrong. You should know better than this. I just let them answer it, and then we'll go from there. And I'm trying to be as delicate as I possibly can with them. And because I do see that there is a lot of ignorance, and I mean that in the real sense of the word. I'm not trying to say they're stupid or anything, because they're not. LDS people are, for the most part, very smart people. They're
just uninformed about what they're supposed to believe. Now, just I want to quickly say something that is important in the evangelical church. Many Christians we would regard within the context of the evangelical church are also uninformed of what they are supposed to believe.
That's true. That's true.
Right?
I'll even admit that.
So you have kind of gradations of even pastors. I mean, we just saw a survey come out this week. 37% of evangelical pastors do not have a biblical worldview. That's not a really good situation, because it means those that they are pastoring also are not going to have a biblical worldview. So it's not unusual. Jehovah's Witnesses tend to do a better job than most groups, and yet, like you, I have to ask them what they believe before I talk about what the Watchtower believes. And I always make a separation. The Watchtower teaches X, which may or may not conform to what they believe. I had one situation where I was talking with a couple again, and we were talking about the one sitting on the throne, and that the Lamb is on the throne, the Father's on the throne. And she said at one point, she said, "Well, it's a really big. It's like a couch. It's a really big throne, and a lot of people sit on it." And I thought, and I said, "Well, that's inventive. You do realize that's not what the Watchtower teaches, but it is an interesting solution to the problem, right?"
Let's go back to my original story about the gold plates, because I see that same example.
Right.
When I get to the point where I can show them that even a buff farm boy is not able to carry plates like this, then they switch to another excuse. They'll say, "Well, don't you believe in miracles?" And I says, "Well, as a Christian, of course I believe in miracles. The problem, though, there doesn't seem to be any mention of a miracle when it comes to this story. Joseph Smith never claimed he needed a miracle to carry the plates home. The witnesses who hefted the plates never said they needed a miracle to do that. Emma Smith, who, according to the record, used to move the plates around in the Smith home while they were covered up, she never claims that she needed any kind of supernatural strength to do that."
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, this supernatural strength argument,
Well,
and when they do that,
she must have been a very buff farm lady, though.
Yeah, buff farm lady, exactly.
But here's the thing: when they do that, I remind them that I notice that you're not sticking to the story as it's related in your manuals and in your history books.
Right.
Could it be that you don't believe the story any more than I do? See, that's where I'm trying to get them. I'm trying to get them to see, for this story to make sense, even for them, when I start walking them through the narrative, they can't even believe it as it's written. And they have to start inventing all these details in order to make it work even in their own mind. And I found it to be quite effective.
When you say effective, have you ever found, effective in maybe getting them to think?
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to get them to think through this. And what I'll do is I'll often challenge them. I'll say, "Look, I have LDS missionaries come to my home and they've tried to sell me on the Book of Mormon story. I says, this is my stumbling block. Help me out with this, educate me, convince me why I should believe this story. And because these are the things that are stopping me from believing it." And then they'll do this. I had another guy do this. He says, "Well, forget all that. Just pray about it according to Moroni's prayer."
Right. Well, the burning in the bosom.
Exactly. And I say, well, here's the problem. If there were no gold plates, there is no Moroni.
Right.
There is no Moroni's prayer. So let's not jump the gun. Let's work through this thing in kind of an orderly manner and convince me that I should even believe that there was a character named Moroni. Because so far, this book sounds to me like it's nothing more than a 19th century novel. And if that's all it is, I'm not going to put my trust in it as ancient scripture.
Have you seen a Mormon who listened to you and then maybe processed it in his or her mind over, I don't know, it could be years sometimes, and then come back to you?
In fact, many times it takes years for them to process.
I would think.
Sometimes even when they've come to realize Mormonism isn't true, they may not go find their way into a Christian church right away. In fact, many of them will never find their way into a Christian church. We have a pretty dismal casualty rate out here. Once a Latter-day Saint realizes that they've been lied to, they don't want much to do with anything that speaks of any type of religious faith, even Christianity. Well, why is that? Well, I think because one reason is the well has been poisoned when it comes to the Bible. They've been told the Bible can't be trusted. And what am I going to do when I'm trying to convince them of Christianity? That's the source I'm going to go to. So I think it kind of helps us as Christians to have a pretty much of a working knowledge as to how our Bible came to be, and maybe disperse with some of those stereotypes that a lot of Latter-day Saints unfortunately have regarding the Bible, to show them why we believe it to be something worth trusting. It takes a little more work to do that, that's for sure. But I certainly hope that we as Christians don't fall into the same the same category as they do. Well, I just know it's true. Well, that might work in a holy huddle at your local Bible study, but that's not going to convince people outside of our realm. We've got to give them a little bit more than that.
Have you met Mike and Lynn Wilder?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So there's an example of Christians, and in fact, their family came out of Mormonism, and it was. I'm not sure. I don't have the whole story on the son yet. I haven't read through the book, to find out what it was for him, but he appealed to it.
Are you talking about Micah, the son who went on his mission? Yes. I'm good friends with Micah.
So he was converted here in Florida, was it, or that was the start of it?
Yeah, he was challenged. He was challenged by a Baptist pastor that Micah went to go convert to Mormonism. Didn't quite work out. And he was challenged to read the Bible like a little child. Just try as much as you can to set aside your biases and read it for what it says.
And that ended up being it for the whole family, it seems. That was the antidote. Just read the Bible and try to set aside your presuppositions, the other things, and it's hopefully you can move them from, okay, here's the problem with the golden plate story, here's the problem with a whole bunch of other things, and then to take them to shift gears and say, look, so that they don't have time to just say, well, all religions must be the same, all religions must be frauds, phonies, institutionalized religion is just a sham. I did not become a Christian to join an institutional religion. I was born and raised in an institutional religion that claims to be the original, and I didn't. That's not what I was looking for. Now, I don't think Christians or any group of humans, you end up forming groups that you might call institutions. You create groups, you create societies, you create structures that help you to do the main thing that you want to do, which in our case is to learn more about Jesus, learn more about the Bible, and worship him.
Right.
So anyways, I just thought I'd interject that. I don't want to derail you.
So where's another area of lore that you run into, maybe the Christians are using inappropriately, or that Mormons believe?
Well, I think another area that becomes kind of a pitfall in a witnessing scenario, but one that I wouldn't totally reject, is using sources that were probably very much respected years ago, let's say in 19th century Mormonism, but are kind of embarrassing to modern 21st century Mormons. And this would be, for instance, citing the Journal of Discourses. Now, the Journal of Discourses is a collection of a number of sermons, mostly given by Brigham Young. There are other leaders that are mentioned in there as well. But it's a number of sermons over about a 50-year period. It includes the King Follett Discourse by Joseph Smith that he gave before he died. But sometimes when you go back to the Journal of Discourses, because it's not often cited in manuals any longer, it certainly was for a number of years. And I might mention, as late as 1963, I believe, the Deseret News had an ad in one of its newspapers encouraging members to get a set of the Journal of Discourses. And of course, now, because the Journal of Discourses, it teaches a 19th century type of Mormonism that a lot of Latter-day Saints would be more comfortable getting away from. If you were to cite the Journal of Discourses, you can do it as a historical lesson, but don't assume that the Latter-day Saint believes a lot of what Brigham Young taught back then, or others for that matter, because that may not be the case. Brigham Young was known for teaching all sorts of strange things, and he could teach it off the top of his head, and but because he's the prophet and he said he's never yet given a sermon that you might not call scripture, a lot of his followers back then believed everything that Brigham Young said. Modern Latter-day Saints, not so much. So even though that is good historical material, if for nothing else, to just show you how wacky some of these early leaders were and some of their teachings, it would be erroneous to assume that modern Latter-day Saints believe the same thing. So bringing that up to say, well, this is what you believe. No, that's not going to be what they believe. And there are a lot of things that are in the Journal of Discourses that, again, have a lot of historical value, but I think we would be wrong in taking it to the step and expecting the Latter-day Saints today to believe what was in the Journal of Discourses, or at least all of what is in the Journal of Discourses.
Like the Mark of Cain theory, is that in the Journal of Discourses?
No, that actually, I think, goes to the Book of Moses, which is in the Pearl of Great Price, and also the Book of Abraham talks about these things. So that would be fair game.
That would be embarrassing. That would be embarrassing in the transcript.
Subject to Latter-day Saints because when the Gospel Topics essays came out beginning in 2013, and I might explain that these essays came out periodically. They were written by Mormon scholars. They were not written by general authorities in the church, but they were meant to explain a lot of these very confusing and often embarrassing aspects of Mormon history and doctrine to the membership. It kind of backfired on them in many cases because they were being so transparent that when people were reading these essays, they first of all probably were wondering, is this really put out by the church? It sounds like stuff that our enemies have been saying. And I often kidded around saying, I'm glad your church is finally getting up to speed on this. We've been saying this for decades.
Exactly,
now they're admitting all this stuff.
Right.
Well, that would be a good source to go to because it's on their official website, which used to be LDS.org. Now it's churchofjesuschrist.org. You can find those essays on there. I have spoken to many Latter-day Saints and referred them to the Gospel Topics essays to verify some of the things that I am saying that the church is now admitting.
Yeah. The Watchtower did a kind of a similar thing a number of years back because so many of us that were witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses would use their material. Say, okay, here's what they taught in 1879. Here's what they taught in 1913. Here's what they taught in 1915. And we have copies of the material. And the Watchtower often would try to deny that, but it's hard to deny it when you have so much printed history. Printed history is a bad thing for a false prophet organization.
Yeah, and one thing with the Mormons is they wrote everything down. I mean, all you have to know is where to look.
Exactly.
For your average member, a lot of them don't know where to look. And so we kind of want to help them. And we
did that. And we talked about the pyramid that was built, by the cemetery where Russell was buried. And they would deny that. So we took photos of the pyramid and we had Watchtower material. Well, then in this history book, they alluded to it and they even show a picture of it. So what they've done in essence is inoculated the people. Not enough they didn't give enough to really get them out of the organization, but enough to where when we would present information, they go, yeah, I've heard about that. And then you kind of shut off.
Well, these Gospel Topics essays, one of the reasons why they're so valuable, as I said, because the church puts them out and church leaders have had to actually come out and tell members, yes, these are recommended by the First Presidency for you to read and believe. And I'll give you an example. When the Race and the Priesthood essay came out, they did not treat Brigham Young very well. They basically blamed Brigham Young for the racist doctrine that the church had believed for much of its history. Now think about the admission of this. So you've got a racist as one of your prophets, because that's basically what they were saying. Brigham Young was reflecting the bigotry of his time. Now, I'm not trying to excuse Christians who did that too.
When did that come out?
That essay, I think, came out in 2000.
Oh, wow.
14, I think.
Finally.
13 or 14.
Whoa.
And so here they are admitting this, but here's the dilemma for the Latter-day Saint. If you think through it, it wasn't just Brigham Young. It was every leader since Brigham Young were still enforcing the restriction on those of Black African heritage. If they had, as Mark Peterson, a Mormon apostle, said back in the 1950s, if you had one drop of Negro blood, you were disqualified from holding the priesthood. So figure that every leader from Brigham Young on down to Spencer W. Kimball was teaching the same thing and enforcing that same prohibition on its Black members. Well, then Kimball comes up in 1978 and they reverse this position. And now they're not even really calling it a doctrine anymore. It's a policy. Policies you can get, doctrines you can't. The problem with that argument, though, is there's documentation to show that leaders were teaching it as a doctrine. That's how it was understood to be a doctrine.
And they're not, just to put a finer point on it, they weren't teaching it as a doctrine that was their opinion. The claim is that God told them that. They are merely communicating what God has said. So as Ron points out, those who are Christians, some of those who are Christians that practice slavery, for example, and wanted to cite the Bible, they had to do it out of context to pull that off. So God never states that blacks are inferior in some way to non-blacks, for example. He just doesn't do that. And the Bible is very clear against man-stealing, for example.
Correct.
Right? And so that would be a problem.
Well, so does this reflect, I mean, that sounds like an argument from somebody who has kind of a watered down view of prophecy, like somebody like Karl Barth or something. Prophets, are not, the Bible is not inerrant according to Barth and others. They will make room, and even some people who I otherwise like will make room in their theology for errant prophecies,
right,
or something like that. Which is really, we're starting to really water down and maybe exposing a liberalizing tendency that the next generation is going to take even further. It always happens, So is that going on? Is that going on now?
Well, what we find in Mormonism is this huge case of gaslighting, because now if you were to ask a Latter-day Saint, well, okay, you reversed this in 1978, but where was I going with this? Is how did it ever get there in the first place? How did it ever become a policy, if that's what you want to call it? The answer now is we don't know. We don't know. So much of its history, they're punishing these very faithful members for something they can't even remember doing, because this whole reason was because it happened in the pre-existence when we were spirit children of God the Father and Heavenly Mother. They can't even remember what they did, and they're being punished for it. And now the answer is, well, we don't know. Well, they knew up until 1978. They most certainly knew. It was because there was a lack of valiance.
It made the evening news.
Lord in heaven.
I mean, it made and I talked to Mormon missionaries around that time, and they were very adept at the arguments for keeping blacks out of the priesthood.
Yes.
And when they finally changed it, it was a big deal. It was on the nightly news.
It was a huge deal, and it was embraced in different ways by members of the church. I remember Sandra Tanner and Utah Lighthouse Ministry put out an edition on this, and they were commenting on some of the reactions from members. And I remember one specifically said, when they heard the news, it was like hearing about a death in the family. Well, obviously, you're not taking that as good news. Some did, I'm sure, for instance, Mitt Romney, and I'll give him credit on this. I'm not a real Romney fan, but I will give him credit on this. I think Romney was kind of ahead of his time. His father was ahead of the time in saying, hey, this is wrong. It shouldn't be like this. Unfortunately, though, the Romney family had no authority to see anything like this changed. It had to come from the top down, as a lot of major changes in Mormonism have to come from the top down.
So is this an example of the God of Mormonism yielding to political and public pressure? And is that any different than what happened when they changed their doctrine on polygamy? Didn't that come about as a result of political pressure.
Most certainly. And even Wilford Woodruff, the fourth president of the church, who was behind the manifesto of 1890, as much admitted that if we didn't make this course correction, the church would be dissolved. The government was going to take away, the government was already taking away a lot of church property. They were getting ready to move on to the temple. Okay?
Wait a minute, we're talking in the United States.
In the United States, yes.
They're getting ready. Wait a
They
minute.
were confiscating property from the Mormon church
because of the no black.
No. This was over the polygamy issue.
Okay, we're going back further.
Over the polygamy issue. So Wilford Woodruff, he did this because he really had no choice. Already leaders were being put in prison. In fact, we have a restaurant down the street from where I live where there's a huge picture of George Q. Cannon, who was a member of the first presidency under Brigham Young, in prison garb, surrounded by a bunch of other prisoners that were incarcerated for unlawful cohabitation, as it was understood in the 1880s. They were arresting these guys. They were putting them away.
This was before they were a state, too, wasn't it? Or was it after?
This was preventing them from becoming a state.
Right. Yeah, because you're in the United States territory.
Correct.
I mean, the laws of the United States are enforced. So, and they were breaking them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were vocal in breaking them. There was a lot of bravado up until 1890, where they would say things like, well, we'll never give up polygamy. To give up polygamy would be to give up Mormonism.
And some of them haven't, have they?
Well, what happened after the manifesto of 1890 is they were practicing it still secretly, and there were marriages that were performed secretly, making it necessary in 1904 to come out with the second manifesto, what I call the Now We Really Mean It manifesto. And now the church is going to excommunicate anybody involved in unlawful plural marriage. And so they kind of put the hammer down, and this is where you find the splinter groups forming, the fundamentalist splinter groups, who felt that the church had abandoned what Joseph and Brigham and John Taylor, the third president, were saying is true Mormonism. They looked at the church as being the bad guy, and they were carrying on what they were teaching, or the purer Mormonism as they understood it.
Right.
The NWRMI, Now We Really Mean It.
I like that. Well, so Bill McKeever and Ron Hensel and I will be at the Engage 2022 convention in Tallahassee. That's June 3 and 4. So go either go to emnr.org and all the information is there, or go in the description panel below and click on the link and go look at it there. Not Lincoln, on the link. And
go to Lincoln. Lincoln, Nebraska.
Don't go to Lincoln, Nebraska. And Bill will be there. I'll be there. Ron will be there, and a host of others talking about a whole variety of topics. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
In fact, we're going to be talking about some occult religions that few have heard of. Like the one that BLM follows, for example.
That'll be interesting.
That'll be interesting, yeah. All right, Ron, would you care to waltz us out of here?
Yes, I would. Let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our regular cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Leg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping. Original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. No.
Never happen.
No.
All right. Thank you, Bill McKeever, and we'll be seeing you shortly. The Royal
Looking forward to it.
We'll be seeing you in all the old